Ayan na. Kamusta kayo dyan, mga kamets? Mga kameta, ayan, habang meron pa tayong konting postpaid pa, dahil ang hirap 50, 100 pesos nga Gcash lang, hindi naman sasend sa atin. I don't know. I mean, my goodness. At ito, alam mo guys, real talk tayo. Before tayo pupunta dito sa topic natin ng China at pagbubuli sa Pilipinas, yung threat na naman nila sa atin. Kasi, yun nga how are we gonna stand up to the bullies all around the world kung we're not doing our own assignment at home, no? Ito yung isa sa mga pinakamalaking frustration ko, mga kamets. Ano yung gumagalaw yun? Oh, ano pala yun? Anyway, ito kasi mga kameta, no? Ito ang parati kong problema. Gusto mo lumabas sa Manila para hindi ka ma-stress dun sa traffic sa Manila, hindi ka ma-stress dun sa lifestyle sa Manila. Ang problema naman, paglabas mo ng Manila, ang laki ng problema sa basic infrastructure. Signal pa lang problema na. Internet pa lang problema na. Sa panahon natin ngayon, it's almost impossible to get anything done kung hindi matino yung internet. Lalong-lalo na kung katulad nyo, kung trabaho niya katulad ko, di ba, na digital nomad. I heard that term is very woke, trying hardish term. But yung mga people, no, who need to be constantly on the move and constantly produce. Content creators, yun naman yung mga terms na inayo ko. Hindi tayo content creator, may mga expertise po tayo na pag-aralan po natin yung mga bagay-bagay na sinasabi natin, no? Tinuturo po natin ito sa mga iba't ibang universidad all around the world. Now, anyway, balikan natin itong issue na ito. Itong frustration ko, mga kameta, no? Parati na sinasabi, okay, kung stress ka, labas ka na Maynila. Ang problema ng pag lumabas ka ng Maynila, yung mga kalsada, yung mga infrastruktura, ang dami mga nakakadismaya. So, while tanggap ko na pagdating sa cost of living, mas maganda talaga pag lumabas ka ng Manila kasi napakamahal. I mean, Manila is a very overpriced place, no? Napakamahal ang presyo ng mga bilihin, ng rent, ng everything, no? Kumpara doon sa kalidad ng mga serbisyo na nakuha natin. But paglabas mo naman sa Manila, mas mababa yung gastos, mas less stressful siguro ang buhay for other people. But for people like me, mas stressful pag nasa labas ako ng Maynila dahil yung mga basic infrastructure ay nawala doon. Kanina nga may pinuntahan kami na napakagandang restaurant dito, Great Wall Cafe. Puntahan yan, sa Tuba yan, dito sa Baguio, malapit sa Loacan Airport. Napakagandang lugar. Ay. Yung papunta dyan, yung mga kalsada, parang pumunta ka ng wala na, para malayo ka na sa kabiasnan. And to consider this is not too far from, from the city proper, no? And I'm talking about a city which is one of the most developed in the country. In fact, if you look at the Human Development Index, HDI, yung region namin, hindi ako nagyabang, but the region of Benguet is the most developed in the entire country in terms of, hindi lang average income, but in terms of life expectancy, in terms of education, etc. So, on an average, uh, at saka yung agwat ng wealth ay hindi ganun kalayo. So, if dito sa ganitong lugar ay minsan nagkakaroon tayo ng napakadaming frustration sa availability of water, internet connection and all. I don't want to be judgmental, but this is just a more a matter of compassion. I can imagine yung mga basic infrastructure and all could be far more problematic in other parts of the country. Now, bakit tayo dapat may pake sa nangyayari sa loob ng bansa natin? Well, obviously, because this affects our lives, this affects our lifestyle, this affects the experience of going around the country, the ability to experience. Kanila lang nalaman ko na may mga direct flights na ginagawa from Philippines, Manila to Da Nang in Vietnam. Remember mga kameta, meron tayong mga vlogs nung nandun ako sa Da Nang, Vietnam for conference, about economic and trade integration in Asia. And sabi ko, napaka-impressive itong lugar na to kasi I've been going to Vietnam regularly over the past decade or so and I've seen the tremendous development in the area. But let's be honest, it's not a white sand beach. Right, the natural beauty of Da Nang is nowhere close to what we have in Palawan, in Siargao, what we have in Boracay. So we're very blessed with very beautiful nature, including of course dito sa Cordilleras region. Napakaganda rin yung mga ng nature natin. But you have to make something out of it. Hindi pwede yung we're just resting on the laurels of our natural heritage. In the same way na hindi tayo pwede nagre-rest lang doon sa laurels ng ating English-speaking colonial legacy. Yan ang problema natin eh. Parating ko sinasabi, isa sa mga dahilan ng Pilipinas ay hindi umasenso masyado ay hindi lang dahil sa mga katrapuan ng mga politikos natin, which by the way, can be traced back also to the colonial era because one of the biggest mistakes of Americans. So, ito, isa pang real talk. One of the most annoying experiences I always have is some random American gringo guy coming and giving lectures about, oh, this is how you should run your country, blah, 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 blah. Yung mga iba pa, they have the audacity to even say, dapat you should have stayed as our colony or something like that. My thing always to my gringo friends is like, wait. You guys, you had half a century of almost direct colonization. We can talk about the indirect colonization later on. But you didn't have the audacity, you didn't have the foresight of doing land reform and getting rid of Spanish era trapos, Spanish era dynasties, principalities. You know, I can name you many political dynasties in the Philippines today that can trace back to the late 19th century under the Spanish. So the Americans, one of the biggest problem with them is that palpak yung kanilang the state building project in the Philippines. And one of the biggest failures of the Americans when they were colonizing the Philippines was they did not, they did not redistribute land, they did not make sure na hindi man-dominate ng economies and political institutions natin ng mga old Spanish era principalities. Ito yung mga collaborators essentially, yung mga comprador. No? So once the Americans opened the political system to a certain degree of democratic contestation, guess sino mga nanalo ng Senado, Kongreso, mga ganyan? Landed elite. The same trapos from the Spanish era. And they continue up until today, a lot of them. So you have a lot of political dynasties in the Philippines that go all the way back to the Spanish era. And then nadagdag pa ng mga bago, mga parvenus and all. So please lang, dun sa mga ating mga gringong kaibigan, bago kayo mag-lecture sa Pilipinas, sit down in my lectures about, this trajectory of how things went wrong for the Philippines and how neither of our colonial, our colonizers, whether the Spanish or the Americans, got some of the basic of state and nation building right. Now, you don't believe me? Read, for instance, books by Francis Fukuyama or on, for instance, yung isang book niya na, Political Order and Political Decay. Or look at the works of Paul Hotchcroft and a lot of great political scientists, a lot of American political scientists who notice ano yung mga palpak ng kanilang colonization process in the Philippines. In fact, the Americans don't want to even call it colonization. Now, having said all of those things, actually, bilang isang Cordillera person, I mean, of course, Ilocana kami, but because I'm from Baguio, because there's my Cordillera. In fairness naman, mga Amerikano, one of the good things they introduced, at least in this part of the world, in the Cordillera region, was good education system and a certain degree of egalitarian uh, ethics, ethos, for that matter. So I think it's in the Cordillera region where you see much more positive impact of American colonization. But the Americans really didn't touch, yung the foundations, yung broken, rotten, trapo foundations of the Philippine political economy that was carried over from the Spanish era. But anyway, why am I talking about all of these things? Because how are we gonna fight for our rights, di ba? Diyan sa West Philippine Sea, how are we gonna get the respect of other countries, right? If we do not get some of the basic things in our country right, how are we gonna be respected by a rising superpower, right? A rising superpower that has a lot of ethnocentrism, right? Just look at how people in that country talk about other people, right? Or if not people in that country, like look at how their newspaper talk about, other rising powers like Indians, or how did they look at how they talk about, the supposed them being Middle Kingdom and all that blah blah blah. I mean, seriously, I mean, like China was not the greatest civilization, nor were they the greatest empire. They were one of the greats, sure, but they were never the greatest. I can name you many other empires that were just as amazing. Or, I mean, have you guys been to Egypt? Like these guys at pyramids 4,000-6,000 years ago. The Great Wall of China is barely over what 1,000 years ago. I mean, you go to the Middle East, forget about Greece and all. Medyo bata pa yung mga yan. You go to the Middle East, you can find monuments from 3, 4, 5, 6,000 years ago, right? And so kaya I never understood why some people think China is the greatest. No, they're not. They're just one of the guys. Anyway, speaking of which, my thing is, if we do not get our act together sa loob ng Pilipinas, kung ganyan kalaki yung agwat ng development sa loob ng bansa, kung ganito kasabog yung ating state institutions, kung ganito ka-problematic, yung internal politics natin, kung ganun ka-dominated ng political institutions natin, ng mga trapos, a lot of them going all the way to the Spanish era, right? Some of them are not even Spanish blooded, but they have Spanish affectations. Now, you don't want to believe it? Read the book, actually, long essay, Cacique Democracy by Benedict Anderson, right? A lot of these pseudo Spanish names that we have are actually not Spanish. You know, they're a lot of them came from another Asian country and then pa-effect sila na Espanyol na old rich, but they're not. Diba? Anyway, um, my problem is, wala tayong laban dyan sa West Philippine Sea kung hindi rin natin ayusin yung sarili nating bansa. If we don't undertake some of the basic fundamental changes that we need to institute inside our country. So, napakamahalaga yan mga kameta. We need to really get that right. Now, speaking of China, recently, dahil of course, mahal na mahal nila ang Pilipinas, mahal na mahal nila ang peace and harmony and freedom and all of that. Ito yung sinabi ng China. China is always committed to resolving differences through dialogue and consultation and making joint efforts to maintain maritime stability. Maraming salamat. But we will not turn a blind eye towards the Philippines' repeated provocation and harassment. Kalahin niyo pa? Tayo pang nagpo-provoke sa China. Tayo pang nag-aaras sa China. Ayon ito sa China spokesman, yung the Philippines resupply mission dyan sa Ayungin Shoal, which by the way is a low tide elevation. It's not a territory. It's a low tide elevation within the Philippines exclusive economic zone, within the Philippines continental shelf. So, sarili natin bakuran yan. Our resupply dun sa sarili natin bakuran, China considered this as a, quote, deliberate move to create an incident, play victim, and make a show. Well, sir, speaking of playing victim, I know a country which is the second largest country on earth by population, but they were the largest last year. I know a country that is the second largest economy in the world. They have more than 1 billion people, but they talk about themselves as if we're still in the 100 years of humiliation era, opium wars era of 19th century, right? Speaking of playing victim, we can have a long conversation about pa-victim effect of giant superpowers, no, who cry foul about NATO expansion or US bullying, and then they're bullying their own neighbors. In one case, invading smaller neighbor, right? Quite recently. Uh, at of course, very dismissive itong statement ng China ukol dun sa uh, dun sa mga, well, we expose yung mga bullying and all of that. Okay, so ang statement ng China is that this is purely false hype. Alright? So nagpo-false hype lang daw tayo. Nagdo-drama lang tayo. Drama, drama. Drama, drama. Chanel, Chanel. Right? Sabi nga ni Maharlika. The Philippines side, in disregard of repeated warnings from the Chinese side, insisted on sending vessels to intrude into the adjacent waters of China's Renai Jiao, sorry, ginawa ko Arabic, Renai Jiao, and provocatively rammed a Chinese Coast Guard vessel and cause crash. Let me be absolutely clear. There's no basis to China's claims in the area. Their 9-line, 10-line is a complete joke per modern prevailing international law. Hindi ko alam kung anong Recto Bank, Recto University. The Recto Bank sa atin yan, pero yung Recto University. Hindi ko alam saan nila kinukuha itong mga doctrine. Alam natin saan nila nakuha. This actually goes back to after the collapse of the Chinese Empire in the early 20th century, and when the country was going through this period of immense instability and humiliation. So some of their nationalist cartographers came up with mumbo jumbo maps, and that's yun yung source ng 9-line or actually 11-line because it covers also Pratas and Gulf of Tonkin. And then later on, this was adopted by Kuomintang, who later on go to Taiwan. These are the nationalists, and then this was essentially plagiarized and copy-pasted by the Maoist communist forces later on. So yun yung source ng this whole 9-10-line mumbo-jumbo na yan. So ayon sa China, lahat ng mga sinasabi natin tungkol sa kanilang bullying ay false hype, groundless accusation. So wala silang nagawang mali. Wala silang nagawang mali. Lahat ng ginagawa nila tama, tayong mali. At ang mali natin mga kamets is we are resupplying our own people inside our own backyard. Alright? Again. Ayungin Shoal Second International is a low tide elevation per Arbitral Tribunal Award of 2016, which was under the aegis of the United Nations Convention of the Sea under Article 287 Annex 7, and it was never up to China to determine the jurisdictional issue. It was up to the court to determine whether this was a jurisdictional issue, and the jurisdictional issue was firmly resolved when the court made it clear that this was not about territorial disputes, but maritime disputes, sovereign rights, and more importantly, this was about the determination of the nature of disputed land features. So those legal those legal nuances are very very important, no? So wag kayong magpauto-uto diyan dun sa mga biglang West Philippine Sea expert na, 'di ba? Yung si attorney Pun ba yan? Yung mga magagaling diyan. Yan, yung mga biglang expert na. Alright, ito. Now, but despite everything I've said a while ago, which of course all are based on facts and based on very nuanced understanding of history. Now, let me tell you one thing. Kasi kanina iniisip ko talaga ng mabuti ito eh. At sabi ko, bakit ang mga Chinese sobrang overreact? Of course, when we talk about China, we're not talking about Chinese people or fantastic people. We have nothing against Chinese people, Chinese nation. They're fantastic people of Chinese background. Obviously, not against our fellow brothers and sisters who are, from. So no, we're talking about just the certain policies of the Communist Party in China. They have some policies which internationally are kind of okay because they balance out also the bullying from the West. I have no problem with some of them. But I have a serious problem with their West Philippine Sea claim and the bullying situation in the West Philippine Sea. So I always, hindi tayo hater. We make a distinctions here, case-to-case basis. But going back to this, I mean, obviously, you still don't want to live in a totalitarian system, that they have. Anyway, going back to this, nung iniisip ko na mabuti ito, in a way, naintindihan ko bakit ganyan yung reaction ng China eh. No? There is both a tactical, operational aspect to this. There's also a psychological and strategic aspect to this, right? So the tactical operational is kind of easy to grasp. Ganito ang reaction ng China dahil ayaw nila na ang Pilipinas ay magpalakas ng kanyang position dyan sa West Philippine Sea. Because they'd rather have the Philippines and other rival claimant states in the area, they would rather have them remain in a weak position. Because the more they remain in weak position, diplomacy, code of conduct, negotiations, all that blah, 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 just essentially enables, facilitates, and legitimizes the situation. So China always wants to have that tactical operational superiority over other countries. So when Vietnam, for instance, tries to also do its own mini version of militarization, or Malaysia tries to push ahead with unilateral exploration, blah, 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 China responds. But that still doesn't answer you the other question, which is, bakit parang yung reaction ng China sa Pilipinas ay medyo mas bully kaysa yung reaction nila sa ginawa, for instance, ng Malaysia, which is to completely ignore China's repeated warnings and maritime militia deployments to the South China Sea when Malaysia, the Petronas, West Capella, yung oil drilling platform pushed ahead with unilateral exploration of oil and gas in the area. And ang basa ko dito is, well, partly it has to do with, of course, bilateral direct diplomacy that these countries have with China, but it also has to do something with the fact that bilateral diplomacy in the Philippines has gone very wrong. And not under BBM, but actually under the former president. Sa aking palagay, yung isa sa pinakamalaking dahilan, if not, ito yung pinakamalaking dahilan, na ganitong ka-OA, tawagin natin yan, napaka-OA yung response ng China sa atin. We're just doing what we have been doing for a long time, which is just resupplying our troops there. My goodness, i-google nyo yan, di ba? Yung mga tropa natin dyan, yung Sierra Madre na pinark natin dyan sa yung Inshol, more than 20 years na po yan. Panon pa ni Erap yan. So bakit ngayon sobrang nag-overreact ng China? Ang aking basa dito is, a lot of that is psychological. And a lot of that is because yung isang bully dyan ay na-spoil nung dati nating presidente. Because it looks like, we have to yet confirm it, yung nakaraan na presidente natin na I love China, China will protect me, China, yung mayor president na I will jet ski there, and then nung naging presidente, biglang iba ng inip ng hangin, yung make us a province of China, pa-joke-joke na napaka-inappropriate, or whether was it really a joke, yung presidente na yan, dahil sa mga ginawa niyang ganyan, dahil sa kanyang subservience, dahil sa kanyang napaka-slavish na rhetoric, dahil sa kanyang passivity in face of repeated aggressions throughout those years. Parang ang nangyari dyan is nasanay yung isang bully dyan na whenever they do any bullying thing, there will be no significant reaction or resistance. So nasanay sila Sudan. And in fact, naalala ko, nung 2020 natin, di ba? Nung daming nagalit na naman sa China dahil sa nangyari sa Whitsun Reef at sa Juan Felipe Reef. Even si Manny Pacquiao ay nagalit nun, di ba? You have a situation whereby the president will take the side of China. So even when you have senators, civil society groups, congressmen, or whoever who has some basic sense of patriotism comes out and criticizes China, you have a president who immediately will take the other side, right? So you had this situation before, mga kameta. This was the uh, this was essentially the status quo for year after year after year after year. So dahil nasanay yung isang bully dyan sa West Philippine Sea, sa ganyan kalakaran sa Manila, at nag-expect sila na tuloy-tuloy yung kanilang ligaya after the 2022 elections dahil natalo si Lenny, natalo si Lacson, natalo si Pacquiao. Lahat ng mga matapang sa West Philippine Sea issue ay natalo last year in last year's elections. Di ba? Tingnan nyo mga statements ng presidential candidates last year. Matapang ang statements ni Lacson. Matapang ang statements ni Pacquiao. Matapang yung statements ni Leni Robredo. Ang hindi lang matapang na statements laban sa China, with some slight exception dahil dun sa SMNI debate, biglang may konting si BBM. Si BBM lang yung pinaka mabait yung mga statements niya ukol sa China and very skeptical towards the United States. Of course, what China did not realize is that ibang presidential elections at iba yung real governance, and once you become a president things could change, but more importantly what they missed is that the Marcoses are not the same as Duterte's, and particularly BBM doesn't think like Digong, and BBM doesn't think like Sara. BBM thinks more like his father, Marcos Sr., when it comes to the West Philippine Sea issue. And let's not forget, Marcos Sr. was extremely assertive pagdating sa West Philippine Sea issue. He was the Filipino president that made sure we have those facilities. Yung mga pasilidad na nakita natin sa Pag-asa, 1970s pa yan. Panon ni Marcos yan. At yung panon ni Marcos, doon tayo nagkaroon ng international efforts kung saan nagsama-sama yung mga archipelagic states, island nations in the Indo-Pacific, in Asia-Pacific, para magkaroon ng common front doon sa negotiations of United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So nagkaroon ng, meeting ng mga leaders from across the region ng smaller nations. Nagsama sila. Marcos Sr. brought them together, and together they negotiated for a final version of the United Nations Convention Law of the Sea kung saan pinoprotektahan yung interest ng mga mas maliliit at mas mahihirap na bansa. So I have serious issues with the human rights record, the economic record of the dictatorship. I think it was one of the most incompetent and corrupt dictatorships anywhere on earth. At least yung ibang dictators, at least they made, Samsungs and LGs and all of that possible. Itong dictator na to, wala tayong nakuha. Kundi mga utang at mga problematic stuff. And please, if you have 20 years in power, obviously you're gonna, sana naman, may mabuild ka naman, baka naman, diba? So, anyway, going back to this. But sa West Philippines is a foreign policy. In fairness, si Senior, I think he got it. He had a basic understanding what was strategically important for the Philippines. Now, yung anak niya, I may have disagreements with you on certain issues, on domestic issues. Maharlika foreign. And we can go on and on, right? But in fairness, I think pagdating sa foreign policy, yung sensibility niya ay mas malapit sa kanyang ama. And we confirmed this in multiple interviews that we had with Ambassador Romualdez, 2 interviews at least, earlier this year. And Ambassador Romualdez, of course, is not just our ambassador to the United States. He's not just a veteran journalist. He's also a close cousin of President Marcos Jr. and he's a very close advisor of President Marcos Jr. So he knows what he's talking about. So sa tingin ko, dahil itong China ay hindi nakikinig sa mga experts na katulad natin, because I've been saying this for quite some time. Sinulat ko yan. Last year, June pa lang, sabi ko, BBM will be different from Duterte. He'll be more like his father than Tatay Digong. Right? I made it absolutely clear. But hindi naman, mukhang hindi yan ang binabasa ng embahada ng isang kaibigan natin dyan. Ang binabasa nila yung mga makapili. Mga makapili analyst na walang publication na relevant, walang na-publish na any relevant peer-reviewed publication, wala silang publication ng any legit book, wala silang any expertise established, wala, mga essentially mga, alam mo na, di ba? So, itong makapili club na yan, unfortunately, mukhang sila lang pinapakinggan ng isang embahada dyan. Kaya they were misled to think, first, that BBM would be more like Digong, and B, they thought that even if that were not to be the case, dahil andun si Tatay Digong, pwede i-pressure si BBM ng blah blah blah. But again, yan kasi hindi sila nakikinig sa mga eksperto na na legit. I mean, of course, libre naman na magbasa ng mga sinusulat natin. You don't have to meet us, not because I'm not interested too, di ba? But my point is that they're free to read more legit analysts and experts who actually know what they're talking about and correctly predicted the flow of things, diba? We correctly predict. I almost exactly predicted. If you go to my speech in the National University of Singapore ICS Center in 2016, I almost exactly predicted what will be the Philippines' position as the ASEAN chair in 2017. I said we will downplay the South China issue, we'll overplay issues like drugs, and of course terrorism also because of Marawi, and that's exactly what happened. And so on and so forth. And I said when Duterte will come, he'll try to cancel joint patrols with the US. He'll try to reconfigure yung balikatan exercise. And that's exactly what he did in his first year in office. So, medyo gets na. I mean, again, all my writings are out there. You can go and check it yourself, right? You can also check yung podcast ko with my former colleague. This is interesting. Let me go to it because it's so I had a podcast with Howie Severino last year, right after the elections. And it's incredible. When I read it, it's like, wait, parang yun nga. Ito ang title po niya is What to Expect Under the Second Marcos Administration, according to Richard Haydarian. Okay? Sabi ko, Marcos wants to be like his dad in the sense that he wants to have an A-list cabinet. Whether he can assemble that is another question, which is, yeah. So I look forward to this kind. So sabi ko, ang dapat tingnan natin yung DOF, DFA, and DND. I heard Gibo could be considered after 1 year lapsed yung restriction. Maybe Lorenzana could. So, exactly, that's what happened. Gibo became the DND after 1 year when naglapse yung restriction dun sa mga losing candidates. I expected the top sensitive positions to go to professionals and veterans. And I said, Marcos' game's plan is to show a new face, good face to the world, and try to go on charm offensives. I won't be surprised if he'll try to visit Brussels for the Asia-Europe Summit. And I think that will be his debut to Colonial. So, kung pakinggan niyo yung interview ko with Howie Severino, I said, you're not gonna get a Duterte 2.0. You're gonna get Marcos who tries to win back the West, rehabilitate their name, and along the way also adopt a much more palatable position in the West Philippine Sea. And lo and behold, that's exactly what's happening, right? That's exactly what's happening. So, I think a big part of what we're seeing right now is yung China, nasa denial phase pa rin sila. Hindi nila matanggap na itong presidente ng atin ngayon ay hindi katulad ng dating presidente, and they're having a hard time accepting the fact that actually this is not about Marcos per se. Any decent, self-respecting, and I'll be very honest about it, patriotic Philippine president, right, will make sure that we do the minimums, the very minimums. And isa sa mga minimums na pwede natin gawin sa West Philippines is yung constant resupply mission dyan sa yung Inshol, and eventually fortify our position in the area para solid yung presence natin dyan, literally and figuratively, right? So this is not about BBM being a great president per se. This is about BBM doing the common sensible thing. And by the way, a survey just came out that said majority of Filipinos actually support the current course of action. Oh, yung mga Makapili Club, kamusta naman kayo dyan? Medyo galingan nyo naman ng konti. 3% na lang yata ang support nyo. Anyway, ang point ko dito is, by the way, may statement na ba mga Duterte, si VP sa nangyari sa West Philippine Sea? Patapos na po ang taon. Medyo, nasaan na po yung statements? Okay, anyway, going back to this. Ito kasi mga kameta. Ito lang. So really, this is my read. So just to simplify this, just be super simple and simplify this. I think, ayusin natin yan. Okay, just to simplify this, mga kameta, I think a big reason why China is so OA and overreacting dyan sa West Philippine Sea is not only because they want to intimidate us and they want to dissuade us from pushing ahead with further expansion of enhanced defense cooperation agreement. It's not only about us not granting the Americans more access to bases close to Taiwan. Of course, this is very important for China. This is not only about them trying to also intimidate other ASEAN countries from supporting us and standing shoulder to shoulder with us and expressing solidarity. This is not only about signaling to other ASEAN countries that, hey, you want to think twice before bringing in other powers to push back against us, and that we want to just deal with us one by one, because we know, if you're the big guy, you always want to deal with other countries one by one. You don't want them to unify or get help from elsewhere because you don't want a level playing field. No, I think all of those things are somehow a factor, but I think the biggest factor here and the most underappreciated factor is very psychological. For almost 6 years, China had someone like Rodrigo Duterte in power in the Philippines. This was a president that consistently undermined our position in the West Philippine Sea. He thrashed, and in a way, almost trashed our own arbitration victory in 2016. Never use it as a leverage because this is about diplomacy and strategy. It's all about leverage. One, of course, China was never going to accept 100%, but you could have used it as a leverage. This is the president that undermined our position by bashing our traditional allies while we didn't have much of defensive capabilities of our own. This is the president that year after year after year would make jokes about us being province of China, jokes about his jet ski, jokes about not so jokes. He would say that we should be meek and humble and all of that. So this is the problem. Nasanay yung isang bully dyan sa West Philippine Sea na ganitong mga liderato natin sa Pilipinas. And even when the Filipino people or senators or congressman, someone like Pacquiao would come out and say, oy, mali yan, di tama yan, sabi ng China, andyan naman si Digong Di-defend naman tayo niyan, di ba? Or, nung binangga yung Denver, dyan sa Reed ng Recto Bank. Anong ginawa ng presidente? He essentially pirated the line of not our own officials, not Secretary Lorenzana, not anyone who knew what was happening, on the ground, which is, grabe yun Isang suspected Chinese militia just ramming into a Filipino vessel in an area which falls within our, it's sovereign rights, no? No. So, for 6 years, nasanay sila sa ganitong presidente, sa ganitong kalagayan, at ganitong kalakaran, in a way, in the Philippines. So, now that we finally have a president who's doing the basics, the, the common sensible thing you expect from any self-respecting, patriotic, dignified president, parang hindi nila matanggap yan. So, they're still in that denial phase. And while they're in that denial phase, they're lashing out, and they're trying to silence us, and they're trying to bully us. But the problem is that the more they do that, the more they're going to act immature, and they're going to act in this whiplash approach, the more they're actually setting the stage for tensions in the region. So the provocation and bullying and intimidation is not from the far smaller, poorer country, which is the Philippines, but it's clearly from the other side. But so long as that side doesn't have self-awareness, and so long as that side is not going to rely on good analysis, so long as that side is going to just rely on makapili experts, we're going to walk into a very, very dangerous situation, a perilous situation. But gladly, the Philippines is not alone. On that note, thank you very much